Aditya, start recording, please.
Yeah. CA Srikant Maheshwari has over 14 years of experience in the field of financial services. He currently works with Newquest Capital, a leading private equity group in their finance and compliance department. Prior to joining Newquest, he has worked with CX Partner, Debt Fund, and SR Bartleby and Company in their financial services audit department. He is currently co-opted member of Committee for Export of CA Services and WTO of ICI. Previously, he has co-opted member of Digital Accounting and Auditing Board of ICI and Public Finance and Government Accounting of WIRC. He is an avid chess lover. By the way, he won the first prize in the annual games of WIRC of this year. So now I welcome Mr. CA Srikant Maheshwari. Please, Srikant, are you there? Srikant ji?
Hello. Yeah. Can
Yeah,
you hear
over
me?
to you. Yeah, over to you now.
Thanks. Thanks, Manthan, for the introduction. Aditya, I'm just sharing the screen. So. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. So for today's presentation, I will be covering the following areas. One is the roots and the private equity key terms and jargons. I mean, in private equity, people have a habit of making things complicated and throwing on weird jargons, which is so just a brief person that. Then the two, I'll be covering two areas of investment in India. One is a FDI, that's foreign direct investment. The other would be a foreign portfolio investment. I would be moving to the taxation of the private equity field, and after that, some of the structures that are available for the PE funds. I mean, how the PE fund is constructed. I mean, be Mauritius or Singapore, and then how they invest in India. So even the investment and the exit process. So what I will do is, I mean, after I complete a particular section, I'll ask for questions if anyone has questions, or we'll take the questions at the end as well. So,
And at the end only.
at the end, okay.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So first, so the foreign exchange routes that are available are one is, I mean, of course, the foreign exchange in India is governed by FEMA and RBI. There are two means wherein the foreign exchange can be bought in India. One is a capital account and another is a current account. So the interesting definition of current account is whatever is not capital is current. And so, sorry, whatever is not current is capital, and whatever is capital is not current. But I think for capital, they've given a definition that all items that affect your assets and liabilities would be considered as capital. I mean, so effectively, if an inflow comes in, it affects your liability, that's share capital, even if it creates a contingent liability. So even a for bank guarantee given by a foreign private equity person or even a firm against shares held by them, I mean, by pledge of shares held by them in an Indian company, that would be considered as FPI. So, for example, we have a portfolio company which gives a guarantee, which is given a guarantee against by pledging the shares of the portfolio company, and the portfolio company is getting loan. So, even if there is no FX movement outside India, it would be considered as FDI because you have a liability, contingent liability created on the foreign party by virtue of the Indian assets. There are three routes under capital account. One is the foreign direct investments, other is a foreign portfolio investments, and then is a foreign venture capital investment. I would be only covering the first two bit. I mean, FVCI is a bit more complex and it's not that prevalent these days. I mean, people, because FPI and FDI covers majority of FVCI and the benefits are not that much for FVCI, so I'll be only restricting myself to FDI and FPL, FVCI. Okay. Now, moving to the key terms and jargons that private equity funds use. So you have general partner or GP. So this is the manager of the private equity fund. If I draw a common parlance between a mutual fund and a private equity fund, they're pretty much similar. Only thing with the mutual fund, the investors are of small ticket sizes. I mean, you can have a 1,000 rupee investor, 15,000, 20,000, or even a bigger investor. But in private equity, generally the investors are pretty I mean, professional investors, which who have bigger ticket sizes, who invest a lot of money. I mean, so private equity sizes could be anywhere between $1 billion to 15, 20, 30 billion dollars. I mean, even more than that. Some US funds. I mean, Saudi funds have $1 trillion as the assets under management. So, so a GP, if you take under common parlance, would be a fund manager, similar to a fund manager of a mutual fund. So we call them general partners. These guys are responsible for the day-to-day management of the fund and the investment process and the investments. Limited partner is, same again, an investor to the fund. So limited partner can be an individual, company, corporate, anyone who invest in the fund. They're simple. If you take an example, again, it's an investor to a mutual fund. It's similar to an investor in the mutual fund. Now, what happens is in private equity, when we say we raised funds, there is a capital commitment that happens. So an investor would say, I commit, say, 1 crore rupees to this fund. But the investment doesn't happen immediately. I mean, you have to explore ideas. You have to go through various channel checks, diligences. So over the period of the investable life of the fund, the LPs commit the capital to the fund. So it is called as capital commitment. You can draw, and the next one is drawdown. So whenever an investment idea fructifies, the the GPs would give a call to the LPs to make the capital commitment. So the LPs have to honor the. I mean, these are very big institutions. So they generally honor the capital call, and the money is received by the LPs by the GPs to invest. So effectively, what the process is, when first I get a capital commitment. After that, once the capital commitment is received, I find investment ideas based on my funds guidelines. Once I receive the funds guidelines, I get I've called for capital. That is a drawdown, and after the drawdown, I deploy. So that's the deployment. That's the process. Okay. So drawdown and capital call can be almost equal, used interchangeably. Why the fund business is so lucrative is due to the management fees. So the typical management fees would be 220. So 2% management fees of the total capital committed, and 20% is the carry. So the carry is the, I mean, so 2%, if I would say, is the bread, but carry would be your jam, cheese, your salad, everything is carry. Carry is one of the biggest sources of income for. I mean, so if a fund makes carry, it is a very big number. I would come ahead. I mean, how carry is distributed as well. So these are the type of funds. So you have a parallel fund known as sidecar. So what happens is the fund asks for a commitment from the GPs. So effectively, what it goes is that, if the GP is investing, my money would be more safer because there'll be a skin in the game by the GP itself. So LPs require GPs to be invested along with them. Now, it's typically 0.5 to 2% of commitment, and that's a very big number. I mean, in a $1 billion fund, 2% is a very significant number. So a person who's putting in that kind of money, it is almost, it's almost 1 year's fees that they need to commit So what happens is whenever they find an investment idea, 98 rupees comes from the LPs and 2% is of the GP. Feeder funds. So what happens is there are investors from multiple jurisdictions. So like American investors coming to India, they generally come via the Cayman route. So they will have a Cayman feeder fund. So where all the funds from US would be pulled in, and then they'll come to Mauritius. Whereas in case of India Asian funds, so if you have multiple investors, so you have certain US investors, certain Asian investors. The Asian investors would prefer directly investing into Mauritius. So you'll have a feeder. I mean, the feeder fund does nothing but forwards the investment to the investing fund, which is known as the master fund. Sponsor capital commitment is again well, I covered it before. Preferred return or hurdle rate. Now, what a preferred return means is that this is the minimum return which an investor would expect on his investment. So, 8 to 10% typical IRR is a typical preferred return or the hurdle rate over which the GP would earn carry. So, the first allocation would be towards the preferred return. After that, if the fund earns anything, it would be distributed at 80-20. And then there is a distribution waterfall mechanism that works in. So effectively, 8% you have to earn. 8% might be looking like a very small number. It is 8%. I mean, India mein itna to fixed deposit pe mil jata hai. But you will have to even consider the USD depreciation. So, for example, in my previous fund, we had invested in a Indian company at 60 rupees, and we got out at 66. Now, that's a 10% depreciation on the dollar. So, having that depreciation, and we made about 21% on that investment, but effectively we could only return 10% to the investors because it was just, so 21% minus 10% depreciation, 11% was returned. So hardly any, we were able to beat the hurdle rate. Then the distribution waterfall, I'll be coming in the next slide, so I'll cover that. Carried interest again is the carry what I was talking about. I mean, it is typically 20%. So, and it's a very big number, and it is, where the LPs make, GPs make maximum profit. Clawback is something where, a clause in the agreements with the fund, wherein the investors have a right to receive certain funds back. This is generally done to protect themselves from, any future tax litigations. You have, or if suppose there's some investment which is, so 80% has been sold, 20% is left, but the clawback, in the next 20%, you make zero. So then you might have to recover certain carry which has been given on a deal by deal basis. So moving to distribution waterfall. So the first one is return on principal capital plus. So what happens? Distribution, when you say distribution waterfall, whatever returns the funds generate is distributed between the GPs and the LPs in a particular way. So this is a typical mechanism. You can have different mechanisms. So the first one is return on principal and cost. So whatever expenses plus, so effectively your investments plus management fees plus fund expenses has been incurred by the investors needs to be returned first. Second is the 8% cumulative preferred return. Third would be a catch up if there is if the fund has made exponentially high returns, there will be a catch up that will happen, and then there will be a balance split of 80-20. So whatever after the catch up happens, everything else gets distributed at 80-20. So effectively, the fund manager would earn, in this case, if we simplify, so suppose if you've invested 100 rupees and you made 300 rupees, the fund manager would earn 3% on 30 minus 10, not 108. 108. It will be 30 minus, 300 minus 100. This is the breakup. So you have uh, your investments here. So first, then principal is returned, principal plus cost. Then you have the preferred return, which is typically 8%. Then you have a catch up. So if the fund has earned so much that this you can put this plus this, and this is a 20% of this plus this. So 20% of this. Then after that, you'll have the split. Whatever you earn is 80-20 split. Uh, for setting up a private equity fund, you need constitution document, which is similar to AOA MOA. So Mauritius has a constitution document. So which is the Articles of Association, which will lay down what is the investment objective, manner of capital call, distribution waterfall, and transfers of interest by investors and standard legal terms. Then you have a private placement memorandum. I think even for the Companies Act for issuance of equity shares, we need to file something similar with the MCA. Uh, Private placement memorandum is nothing but a prospectus which we give to the investors. It outlines the strategy of the fund. It provides the details of past performance of the investment team, the key team members, their qualifications, potential risks, what is the tax implications, uh, uh, something about the industry if it's a sector specific fund, what about the sectors. It is a pretty around a 200-page document which you need to submit to the investors before getting the investment. Then after the investor agrees to invest, there is a subscription agreement with the fund and the investor. So you have a subscription agreement. This includes, mainly FATCA disclosures or KYCs, and you agree with the investor. Management agreement, it's also known as the investment management agreement. Investment management agreement is between the investor and the fund and the investment manager. So which agrees to pay fees and whatever other terms are there. Sub-advisory agreement is one of the most important documents here. I mean, people have to be very careful while entering a sub-advisory agreement. So under the sub-advisory agreement, it is an agreement with the Indian manager and the say a Mauritius investment manager to provide sub-advisory services. The importance is that you need to mention. I'll be coming covering this bit later as well. Is that you are providing non-binding investment advice. Your advice has to be non-binding. So if the agreement comes out in a flavor that it is a binding advice, that I say you need to buy this, the fund needs to buy this, and the fund has to buy it, then there is an issue, because in that case you would have a creation of a permanent establishment in India, and all the fund's profits may be taxed as if they were an Indian fund. So you need to be very careful while drafting this sub-advisory agreement. Investor side letters. Now, investor side letters are typically a different arrangement with different investors. Now, what happens is, at times you have a billion-dollar fund. So you have an investor who's investing $500 million, and there's an investor who's investing $50 million. So the investor investing $500 million would want a preferential treatment. So there will be a differential arrangement in respect of management fees, distribution mechanics, participation in investment committees. So you will have a different set of agreement with the investor, because he's investing a larger amount. So that's the investor side letter. Okay. Now a typical fund life cycle. Okay. The a fundraising in these times, I mean, would effectively, I mean, if it was say last year, it would have taken about a year to close a fund and raise funds. But now it typically would take about six months to 2 years to raise a fund. Negotiating with investors, getting them on board. After that, there is an investment period. This is I'm talking about the non-market funds. The market funds, of course, you need to invest immediately and you need to call them. There's a completely different mechanism. These are typically the private equity space where you invest in unlisted securities. Uh, there, the investment period is typically 4 to 7 years. Then you have a distribution, a disinvestment and distribution. So what happens is, you invest in a company. Typically, a private equity investor would seek to exit within like 3 to 5 years, 7 years time. So typically, the you need to dissolve the entire fund. It takes from 5 years to 7 years, with an extension of about 2 years more. So a fund would typically be from 7 to 9 years life, and the dissolution and the after that the fund gets dissolved and needs to be liquidated. So private equity funds are classified based on the multiple characteristics. One is an investment size. I mean, there will be a large based fund, a small size fund, a mid size fund. Then you have in the ownership type. So you might have family offices, which is the uh, investment independent funds. I mean, they're so independent funds are where the funds have, external people as a primary source of capital, and it's like a mutual fund where the investment is scattered around, so there's no single investor which owns a substantial portion. Then you have captive funds. Captive funds is generally, a strong one investor would be very large and other investors might be very small. I mean, so, or even, I mean, most likely a captive fund would be a fund where you have a major investor investing, so there'll be typically only one investor. Semi-captive fund in such funds, although main investors contribute a large part of capital, a capital is so for captive fund, 99.9% would be one single investor, or even 100%. But for a semi-captive fund, it could be 75% and 25% raised by other small investors. Private equities, so you have specialized funds. So you have a pharma-focused fund, you would have a real estate-focused fund, you'll have an infra-focused fund, you'll have, so there might be sector specifications or there might be transaction specifications. So you might have a secondary PE fund, you might have a buyout fund. So after that, moving on, the purpose of the fund also defines the characteristics. You have a master fund and you have a feeder fund. So a master fund is the fund making investments. So you typically, all the feeder funds would pool in their resources into the master fund, and the master fund would make the investments. The fund of funds, this is an interesting concept. So fund of funds is, so fund of funds does not have any brains of their own, but what they do is they invest in other funds. So it typically would be investing into, the private equity funds, which in turn would invest further. So fund of fund is generally a collection of multiple funds. It would be like a mutual fund owning units of other mutual funds. So this is the typical FDI types of funds. So you have a startup or venture fund. A startup or venture fund would typically invest in ticket sizes from $1 to $5 million. It would be, so it would invest in companies which are startup, and they would generally make more investments. So a startup is more like, they'll be investing, say, 50 to 100 entities. So that, the 5 entities become the unicorn, and 30 to 50 entities would become would return capital, and other 50 would be duds. Buyout or growth fund is where this is a private equity space. I mean, this is what we call as private equity, because this is what happens is growth capital is typically between $5 million to $50-60 million. And then you have buyout funds. So a fund which will buy out the management out. So say a promoter has invested, created a company. The buyout fund would buy out the entire promoter stake and even at times replace the management. So the management is held by the management is done by the professional, and the investment is done by the fund. Sector funds, sector focus funds, you have real estate focus funds, so funds which only invest in real estate. Then you have funds which only invest in infra projects. There are funds who invest in only pharma. Then there are sector agnostic funds which invest everywhere. Impact or ESG fund. So uh, impact and ESG fund has become a very big concept recently because of the environmental impact, and investors want to invest in companies which which create change, uh, and they affect the social groups and the environmental impacts and the growth impacts. So uh, impact funds, for example, there's one fund which is invested in change, or there are funds which invest in micro NBFCs, where it's a smaller sector that you. So these funds would not typically invest in alcohol, cigarette sectors. I mean, because they're not they have a socially bad impact. So these impact funds have specific criteria which are socially good funds. Secondary fund, where I work, NewQuest is a secondary PE fund. So secondary PE fund generally buys out a PE fund stake. So you have a buyout by a PE fund. So you typically would have uh, a PE would have invested in a company. The secondary fund would take over the stake of the PE. Uh, so in this case, what happens is the secondary PE fund gets the benefit of a PE managed company. So whenever a private equity enters a company, they generally change the management style. The compliances get hardened. You have official board meetings. You need to have MIS reportings, management reportings. The entire processes are streamlined. So in that case, you have so the secondary fund would typically go and take the PE fund and at a valuation discount. Then you have funds of funds. So a fund of fund, of course, I mean, as in the previous slide, they invest in all the funds. I mean, so you'll have the investment strategy. Then even if you might have a strategic investment wherein two global collaborate might invest in India via a fund. So that might be a strategic investments. Uh, Now moving on to FDI in India. So excuse me. So FDI in India, typically foreign direct investment. It is so the regulators are DIPB, Ministry of Finance and Commerce, RBI, SEBI. So these guys regulate the FDI flow in India and the norms and notifications. And there has been, so previously we had an FDI policy that used to come out. Now they've come out with the FDI, Foreign Exchange Management Non-Debt Instrument Rules for equity investments. And there are multiple circulars of RBI, SEBI, and DIP. I'm restricting myself to equity only. I'm not talking about ECBs, because they are a completely different topic altogether. So my current presentation is just restricted to the equity bit. Okay, so there are two routes in India. So one is the government approval route, and other is the automatic route. And under automatic also you have uh, areas like information technology, financial services, where you can put 100% equity. You can invest 100% in that company. So there's no restriction via the approval. And others where there is a threshold, like insurance companies, you have certain pharma companies, pharma areas, defense, multi-brand retail. So there are threshold. So if you breach that threshold, then you go in the approval route. So under the automatic route, the money flows in. So you might have a company which is 100% allowed, and if you breach that threshold, you will have to go via the approval route for approval of the foreign direct investment. So FDI is, banned in these sectors. I mean, you cannot get FDI in these sectors. The last one being very important for the national security, atomic energy, then the manufacturing of cigarettes. Real estate business, construction of farm house. Well, real estate business, I mean, there is always a question mark on the definition, because whether a company can invest in shops and you know commercial real estate or residential real estate. So the typical consensus has been that real estate can be, you know, under the develop. I mean, can be invested. So you have foreign funds like Blackstone, who's taken over one BKC, the Vatva sale at one BKC, and even invested in Indiabulls properties. So there, this is allowed. Trading in commercial real estate is not allowed. So suppose if I'm doing a buying and selling of flats, so I buy flats, I sell flats, I buy flats, I sell flats. That is not allowed. But primary investment in the builder, that would be allowed. So you invest in the builder, and the builder can do the selling and buying of flats. He can construct for you. That is done. But you cannot have a real estate agency or buying and selling of flats. So the real estate is one very tricky question. But I mean, generally the consensus has been that you can invest in a builder's properties. You can rent out the property, but you cannot be in a business of, selling, actively selling. So you cannot be a very active seller in the market. This is the one, recent amendment. We have had our fights with China and everything. So we are pretty nationalist now, and we need to. So what happened was People's Bank of China (PBOC) had a stake of 0.8% in HDFC. They increased the stake to 1.2% in the month of March, and as per the shareholders report, their name came. Anyone owning more than 1% comes under the shareholders list in the listed equity space. So their name came on the shareholders list of HDFC. So there was a huge hue and cry that Chinese funds and firms are trying to take over Indian companies, and because the valuations are pretty attractive, and there's a COVID issue, and the funds might be in distress, and the China is just trying to take advantage of this. So to avoid that, they introduced a regulation specific. This was a press release first, wherein investment by any country which shares a land border with India is, would be under the approval route. So here, even if it is an automatic route investment, you will have to necessarily go by the approval route. You cannot take the automatic route. So if a Chinese investor is investing money in India, they would have to go to RBI and take the permission, or the government department to take the permission. They cannot directly invest in a company in India. So there are no thresholds mentioned. This has become a very big concern for global funds, which are multiple investors. So a global fund would have an investor from China and investor from US. So the general consensus has been that when you do an ultimate beneficial ownership test, 15% in case of a partnership firm investing as a fund, and 25% in case of a company investing as a fund, can be taken as a threshold. So if I have an investor, a Chinese investor, investing more than 25% in the fund, I would have to go through the approval route. Approval route. The investments are not banned. Investment by China is not banned, but it would take at least 2 to 5 months to get an approval. So I've written 2 to 3, but it might just take 2 to 5 months to get an approval from the Indian regulators to allow their investments in India. Pakistan cannot a fund from Pakistan generally would not invest in India, but even if they do invest, they cannot invest in defense, space, atomic energy, and other sectors which are specifically for the Indian national security. So Pakistan is a completely different, investor, and for Chinese investments, they have come out with this regulation. So this actually affects multiple places. I mean, there are there have been questions in and around Hong Kong as a jurisdiction, because Hong Kong itself uh, is you have Hong Kong as I mean a global financial center. So you have multiple people managing global money out of Hong Kong. Uh, so for them to invest in India, no, so you have a Hong Kong investment manager, and the fund is based out of US. So and investing in India. So there is a question mark on that, whether that would be falling under FDI now, because it's managed by an Hong Kong investor. So uh, I mean that there's a question, that's an open question mark, but ideally, as per me, I mean, what I've heard from Indian custodians, they generally allow that because I mean it's a global fund and the ultimate beneficial owner is not Chinese, so they allow that, and that goes via the automatic route. But this is I mean, this has opened a bit of a Pandora's box. I mean, who gets covered and who not, but that's how things are right now. So an FDI can under equity, CCPS, CCDs. So an FDI can invest only via equity. So you would have to, I mean, there are multiple options available. So you have CCD, CCPSs. Dividend cannot exceed in CCPS cannot exceed 200 basis point prevailing prime lending rate. So the dividend to CCPSs cannot exceed this amount. Generally, a CCPS is issued, I mean, whatever I've seen in my private equity career, is about 0.001%. I mean, it's generally not a very huge dividend percentage which is there. Then you have, for CCDs, you have withholding tax. So withholding tax is an expense for the fund because you do not get credit in your home state. So what happens is, suppose if say a Mauritius fund is invested in India, would have to pay the withholding tax. The Indian company paying them dividends for interest would have to deduct withholding tax, and withholding tax would be an expense, because that withholding tax would not, you would not get credit of that withholding tax in India as well as even in Mauritius. So these are the documents that are there. I mean, for the FDI registrations. So you need a PAN, ultimate beneficial ownership declarations. So you need to declare who is your ultimate beneficial owner. If an individual is identifiable, if an individual is not identifiable, in that case you would have to give a name of a key management person. So a key management person, you would have to tell that he's a key management person, and based on that key management person, so that person would be assumed to be a beneficial owner. So so this has become a big issue, the ultimate beneficial ownership declaration, because many funds do not want to disclose the ultimate beneficial owner. Their agreements with the investors don't allow them to disclose that they are the investors in the fund. So they have to go back to the investors, ask them that we are sharing this information uh, with the regulators, and then I mean there's a back and forth that happens because I mean people don't want to come out in the open and be disclosed as an investor, because they have other filings as well. But now this is a norm, so people have to disclose that. You will have a PPM and a constitution document. Then you have the KYC requirements by the custodian. So I mean, it's a typical DMAT account that gets opened, which is managed by the custody. So if suppose, for example, ICICI Bank has the custody in India. So ICICI Bank would have give you a DMAT account. You cannot have a bank account under FDI. So whatever money comes in the pool account, and from that pool account it gets remitted to the company. You can directly also invest. So I mean, there's no restrictions on investments from a particular person. So you can, suppose you have an account with HDFC custody, you can make the remittance via ICICI as well. So there's no restriction as such, because since the FDI does not have a bank account in India. For receipt of funds, it comes, your custodian will receive the fund in the pool account, and then the remittance should be made out of the pool account. The investee company can directly pay as well. You. So, I mean, you can ignore the custody if the custody is not giving you beneficial rates. Moving on to FPI. So, the FPI regulations have these criteria that, the ones which I've highlighted is more important. I mean, he has to be not a resident in India. He cannot be a non-resident in India as well. A non-resident in India can be in constituents. So what happens is, I mean, this has been there. This was before the elections. The SEBI came out with the guidelines that any NRI cannot invest in India directly as an FPI. So this created a huge hue and cry. I mean, and NRIs can't be fund managers on the managing those funds as well. So there was a huge hue and cry because NRIs, the people who go abroad and manage the fund, they came back to SEBI and said that we go out and we fight for India. We get investors to India, and you are telling us not to be investors. So SEBI told them that there are round trippings and tax evasions and other things happening. So that's the reason why they have come out with the guidelines. So then they came up with a middle view that a non-resident can be an investor or even a fund manager now. I mean, fund managers management is allowed, but the investment cannot be more than 50% in the fund. So an NRI cannot so in a fund, in a FPI investing in India, NRI cannot own more than 50%. So you can have a small portion given to the NRI, but not a very big chunk. Also, when the application comes from a country which is in the sanctions list, the sanction list includes Iran, Iraq, there are multiple 5-6 other countries. So you cannot have an FPI which is registered from these countries. So there are two categories. Category 2 is of course the easier definition, which is not category 1, is category 2. But for category 1, you have your government and government sovereign funds, pension funds, appropriately regulated industry, and from a FATF task force member. So now, appropriately regulated fund means any company which is, so if a fund was established in India, so the mutual fund would be appropriately regulated since it comes under the SEBI purview. Similar thing, you have a FSC in Mauritius and MAS in Singapore. So if the fund is registered and has a business license from Singapore and Mauritius, respectively, then they would get, they would be appropriately regulated. Now, the bigger question in this is Mauritius is currently in the grey list of FATF. So, by virtue of that, you cannot invest. So Mauritius funds would not be eligible for category 1 status. However, the central government has amended the definition. I mean, there's a circular to that effect, wherein the Mauritian funds are the exception to the rule. So, because 40% of Indians' FPI investments come from Mauritius. To allow that, and Mauritius, of course, does not go under the FATF, but is in the African regulatory scheme. So, Mauritius is not part of the FATF countries, but the Indian government, specifically to enable funds who come from Mauritius, has amended the regulation. So Mauritius also funds registered in the Mauritius would now be for part of category 1 and not category 2. So the type of funds, so PE funds, so FPI is also known as hedge funds. We generally take the example of hedge funds to be a funds which manage hedges and arbitrage, but hedge funds is generally a market fund. So the hedge fund definition is generally a fund which would invest in the market. So you have a long only, you have a long short fund. Long only and long short funds are generally funds which would be going long in the market and with a alternate strategy of which might just hedge their risk by betting. I mean, for a long fund, it would be more. I mean, they would take bets against in the indexes. In a case of a long short fund, there might be a strategy wherein they would buy a particular basket and short the other side of the basket. So there are many P funds, many hedge funds which go long on private banks and then go short on public sector banks. So you have a strategy where you buy the winner and short the loser. So in that process, the long short strategy happens. Then you have arbitrage funds. Arbitrage funds are again, these are high analog funds. You'll have funds which do calendar spreads, mostly trades in derivatives. Then you have sector funds. So these funds would specifically invest in sectors like you have pharma, infra, real estate, and then investment funds. So these funds would be sector agnostic, and they will be a normal typical in the Indian parlance mutual funds. So these funds would invest in multiple areas. So they will invest in say Reliance. They might even invest in Infosys, which has, I mean, of course, Reliance today might be taken as a tech firm, but so they can invest in say a BHEL and an Infosys, and so on and so forth. So for the FPI, also the same Indian documentations that you require for a custody account, demat account. So the difference between an FPI and an FDI is that the FPI would have an Indian bank account. So FPI would necessarily need to open an Indian bank account. Why the Indian bank account is important is that all the FPI trades are custody settled. So if suppose an FPI buys say 100 shares of Reliance, the account has to be funded by that amount. There cannot be a case wherein the funds come in late, because then the FPI cannot, then the penalties of non-paying are pretty huge. So and they also go fall back on the custodians. So custodians insist that the FPI have that money in the account before trading. So generally, if the trades are executed say in the afternoon, the account should be funded by morning. Otherwise, the FPI, the custodians then generally don't allow FPIs to trade. Then you have PAN, your ultimate beneficiary ownership is similar to FDIs, FATCA filings as well, and other KYC documents, which typically you would also provide if you want to open a demat account and a bank account. So for the FPI registration, what happens is the custody. So there's a DDP concept, which is effectively the custody. The custodies are allowed to give registration to the FPI. So the responsibility of registration. So first, what used to happen was the responsibility of registration was with SEBI. SEBI said, SEBI, it used to take a very long time for SEBI to give an FPI registration. So it typically used to take anywhere between 6 months to 1 year. And the problem was that you have commitments from investors, and there's those commitments like idle. So to mitigate that, SEBI came out with these regulations that the DDP is allowed to give registrations to FPI. So then ICICI Bank would issue a registration certificate on behalf of SEBI, saying that they have checked all the documents and the documents are in order. This is the registration number which is there granted to the FPI. So the FPI need not go to SEBI. So this has reduced the time of registration. I mean, I recently got an FPI registered in 15 days with all the documents and everything in place. So this effectively helps faster the registrations. The requirements these days is a single application form. This is filled online. Then you have an Indian custody account, INR and foreign bank account. Now, for the FPI, when you make an application for the FPI license, the single application form has a tab wherein you will also get the PAN card. So a person need not apply separately to NSDL for a PAN card. The PAN card gets issued by itself. So the single master form or the single application form, you can get a PAN card allotted as well. And also the documents, I mean, the last point is very important, is that all the documents need to be notarized. Now, notarization is pretty expensive in foreign countries. Like Singapore, it could cost you a bomb. But the solution to this problem is that if try having a custodian who has a branch in that jurisdiction. So ICICI Bank has a branch in Hong Kong, Singapore, Mauritius. So the, the Singapore branch personnel can certify, after looking at the originals, that these documents are true and correct. So effectively what happens is you reduce the cost as well as the time of getting a document notarized. You can just walk into the foreign branch. I mean, you can ask a person sitting there, go to the foreign branch, get those documents certified. And I mean, that process is pretty easy. Then you have a list of custodians. I mean, these are the custodians, these are global custodians, and the Indian custodians as well. Now, moving on to the next item is the taxation. So this is for the assessment year 2021-22. Just a disclaimer on this: any assets and any securities held by a fund, a private equity fund, before 1st April 2017 would be zero rate. I mean, so all investments prior to 2017 have been grandfathered under the old regime. So there is no tax on that. So it's for Mauritius and Singapore, and wherever the tax treaties have been beneficial. You have dividend. I will be covering that in next slide because the rules have changed for this year. Then you have buyback tax. Then you have short-term capital gain, which is almost similar if you hold listed security. For unlisted securities, FDI is considered as a foreign company, and the peak tax rate is applicable in case of short-term capital gain, unlisted securities. Then you have long-term capital gain, which is for listed and unlisted, which is similar. And for derivatives income, FDI is not allowed to have a derivative account, so it's not applicable for them. And for derivatives income, it's 30% plus all the applicable cess and surcharges. Dividend taxation. Now, for dividend taxation, as per the Act, the peak rate is 21.84%. That's 20% plus applicable surcharge. And you have Mauritius. So you have different dividend withholding rates for different countries. So for Mauritius, which is the primary FDI, where the FDI comes in, 5% in case where the company owns more than 10% of a company, or 15%. In case of Singapore, it is 10% or 15%. 10% in case you own more than 25%, and else it's 15%. Netherlands is the best jurisdiction right now because it's the most favored nation. So it is 10% or 5% depending on the holding structures. And again, for US and UK, these are the rates. Now, for the foreign exchange, so the FDIs, foreign investors, are not allowed benefits of the foreign exchange fluctuations. If your FX loss or FX gain, that generally is not, benefit is not given. So what happens is, this is the typical process for converting your foreign gains. So if suppose you have this chart, I mean, so what happens is, if you have an INR to INR transaction, the buy agreement is in INR, the sell agreement is in INR, then the capital gain currency would be INR. In these cases, I mean, there are litigations as well, but what happens is when the FDI invests in India, you would enter an agreement with the portfolio company or some company. Then generally the funds are, I mean, they prefer to denominate the transaction in USD or in INR, as the case may be. However, at the time of exit, typically the exits happen abroad only. So a foreign fund would be buying your stake or the private equity fund stake. So in that case, the agreement would be in USD. So if any side of agreement is in USD, in that case, you might get the benefit of the exchange rates as well. Sorry, you will not get the benefit of the exchange rate. It will be converted in the process benefit mentioned under Rule 115. So for USD transaction, so what happens is your sell price is in USD, less cost of acquisition is again in USD. Your capital gains would be X, and then TT buying rate. So TT buying rate would be the rate as on the last day of the month preceding the month in which the shares have been sold. So what happens is, suppose if I'm selling in July, the rate as on June 30th or 29th, whichever the previous available last day trade rate is available, that rate would be taken for converting the FX into for capital gains. The similar thing, in case of selling in INR, what would happen is the average TT buying selling rate as on the date of the sale would be taken, and you will arrive at the USD sale price. For the cost of acquisition, you will the TT buying and selling rate as the date of the acquisition, and you will get a cost of acquisition, and then the capital gain is computed, and the TT buying rate as on the date of the sale is taken. So now for the treaty benefits, now anything that was before April 2017 in Mauritius and Singapore was zero tax. Now even today, even if you sell it today. So in order to claim the TT benefit, the assessee has to be registered with the relevant regulations in the foreign country. Now what happens is in Mauritius you have a GBL1 license, which is for the investments, a GBL license for the investments, as well as for MAS. MAS issues a fund license. So you need to be registered with the relevant authorities. I mean, your company has to be registered. It cannot be a case wherein you have a company which is a Hong Kong company which is investing via Mauritius, but they have a branch office in Mauritius. That would not help you getting. I mean, there are ways and means to get the benefits, but it is a very difficult process. So you ideally would not get a benefit of the treaty. They have to hold a tax residency certificate. A TRC or a tax residency certificate is one of the most important documents for assessing the tax residential status. Even for when you issue a Form 15 CSCB or making remittances or receiving remittances in India, TRC is very important. TRC is typically, the administrators in Singapore and Mauritius, they typically apply for the TRCs from the regulators, and it's a document which specifically mentions India. And so the important point that we need to take care is that the TRC has to be for the incomes derived from India, and because you get a specific TRC which mentions that they are a Mauritian resident for the purposes of income from India. So you have interest income and dividend income as well. Shares, shares should not be held under the stock and trade portfolio, because if it's held under the stock and trade portfolio, it becomes a business income. For business income, the taxation rate is different. This is only, treaty benefits are only applicable to investments held as investments. It's not in your books. So in case of IFRS and other gaps, it should be available for sale and not held for trading. If it is held for trading, then it becomes a business income, and business income is taxed at the regular rates. I mean, treaty benefits are only applicable for capital gains, and remittance should be made to the own account. I mean, the remittance cannot be going to a different account. Otherwise, you will not get the treaty benefit. Because people might just abuse that. You might have a tax residency certificate for entity A, and the remittance is coming in entity B. So that's not allowed, and should not have a permanent establishment in India. I would be coming to the permanent establishment bit in the next few slides. Okay, now the structure considerations, which is POEM. I mean, it's poem, but it's nothing poetic about this regulation because I mean it's one of the most complicated regulations which the government has introduced for the PE funds. What used to happen? I mean, the background, if I want to give, we have a lot of Indian fund managers under the typical regulation. So all the Indian fund managers sit in India, and you have a Mauritian company which has Mauritian directors and a Mauritian administrator taking care of those companies. However, those Mauritian directors are nothing but rubber stamp. So you just need to send the documents and they'll just rubber stamp and send it back to you. They don't have any right to question. And for that purposes, the government of India came out with a regulation saying that the place of effective management. Now, the place of effective management, because the fund itself does not do anything. So the fund manager is the main person for the fund. And the fund manager, and you have an Indian sub-advisor. So you will have a fund manager and an Indian sub-advisor. In that case, what happens is all the decisions have been taken in India and they're just imposed on Mauritius. That's where the non-binding term sheets regulations are effective because I mean, if you're providing binding and agreeable uh, uh, advice to the investment advice to the fund, then your fund would be treated as if they were part of India only. So poem. So in case of poem, there are two things. There is one is ABOL, which is active businesses outside India. These are the criteria, which is passive income more than income is more than 50%. So in case of funds, the passive income is more than 50%. Your active income is from your sale of goods and services. 50% of the total assets are. So in this case, this is important. So if it's a global fund and you have assets scattered over places, then POAM guidelines will not be applied. 50% of the total employees. So when you say total employees, it's the group of employees. And payroll expenditure is also the entire group. I mean, this is, you would not take this as isolation because those companies, the investment manager companies and the funds do not have that much expenditure. Majority of board, if a person is not engaged in ABOL, the identity, so if they are not engaged, then you have to identify who takes the business decisions. So I mean, if suppose the Indian partners are taking the business decisions for the fund, then they might be considered as a fund out of India. So as for the permanent establishment, I have not gone much into detail of the regulations, but this is the to-dos, the important to-dos list is based on my what do you say experience. So what people generally do is they don't have so how the process works is the Indian advisor will give an advice to the Mauritian fund and the Mauritian fund would invest in India. Now the problem is that people do not document, they only document for the deals which are accepted, but do not document for deals which are rejected. Now, so the tax officer comes back to you and says that what you have done is when you've sent a deal, it has got accepted. So you're providing binding advisory services and not binding. The Mauritius does not have a right to reject the fund, reject the investment. In that case, you need to, I mean, effectively document both your accepted deals as well as the rejected deals. Because since if you do that, then you can go to the officer and say that, look, we've sent 15 deals. After 15 deals, the investment has been made only for one. The PIC and FIC meeting. So there are investment committees in a fund, which I'll be coming later on. So those meeting minutes should be documented. So what happens is you have a presentation given by the Indian advisor. On that Indian advisor's presentation, the funds PIC and FIC, they sign off. So the tax officer comes back to you and says that, okay, there's a signing off on what you've presented. There's been no discussion on it. So, and then this is a permanent establishment in India. The board resolutions have to be very carefully drafted. There has to be clear segregation of duty. I mean, so who's doing what? The entire chain has to be very well documented. I have a case law ahead. I mean, where the income tax authorities, advanced ruling authority, has gone beyond this, and they have given a judgment. Uh, then Indian sub advisor should provide non-binding investment advice. So whenever we send emails to the Mauritian administrators or the Mauritian board of directors or even to other directors, I mean, as for my habit, I always mention that this is subject to authorization post your review. So you have to review. I mean, the review responsibility is there. I might be a preparer of board resolutions for my Mauritius SPV, but still it has to be reviewed by the director. There cannot be a case wherein you write that, kindly sign this SP and send it back to me. I mean, which effectively means that you're giving an order to the fund, and the fund person is very willingly signed the agreement. You have to be very specific that it is a non-binding fund advice. I mean, this is for your consideration post your review. These words have to be mentioned in the mails, because there have been cases where the income tax authorities have asked for emails, the entire email chains, entire email dumps, to check whether these kind of things have been followed or not. Indirect transfer as well. So this is what happens is this is a byproduct of the famous Vodafone, the Supreme Court judgment. Vodafone, so Hutchison SR was a Singapore company which owned shares in I think Hutch India. Vodafone bought the shares of Hutchison SR from Singapore. I mean, I might be getting the names wrong, but there was a Singapore company from which Vodafone had bought the shares. Indian authorities said that by virtue of that company owning Indian shares, there was a capital gain by that Singaporean company, and you needed to deduct TDS, and there's a capital gains implication on that. Supreme Court said that no, there's no capital gains implication, there's no regulations to that effect. The government modified the definition with a retrospective effect, and has now come out with these regulations, which says that if the value of the asset exceeds 100 million, that is 10 crore rupees, and represents 50% of the market value of a company in India. I mean, so what happens is, if it's a global fund and owning only say 25% in India, then indirect transfers would not apply. However, if the fund owns more than 50% and it is more than 50, so suppose a Mauritius company owns a Singaporean company, the Singaporean company has invested in India. In that case, there will be indirect transfer implication if you sell the Singaporean company's assets. So because since there's an indirect transfer of Indian assets in that company. So what happens is your fund investors invested in the company. Now the fund investor, you repay the fund investor as a premium or a gain of his shares. You pay him more. This is very typical in a trust structure where you get more money than what you've invested. In that case, indirect transfers might be applicable. However, I mean, to get around this, there has been a CBDT circular dated 26th March 2015, which says that any dividend declared by a foreign company, whose situation outside India to foreign investors will not be covered under indirect transfer provisions. So what people now do is, instead of redeeming shares at a premium, they redeem shares at par and declare dividend for the balance amount. So it effectively saves. You do not get covered under the provisions of indirect transfer. Because what happens is, there's a foreign investor investing in a company in Mauritius. The company in Mauritius has invested in India. So if you're redeeming shares of the Mauritian entity, there will be an indirect transfer implication on the fund investor. To mitigate that, now they've started dividending out these the gains that they make. Okay, this is a very interesting case of Tiger Global. So Tiger Global and I mean I've called it TG. They held shares of Flipkart. So Tiger Global was a Mauritius company. They invested in a company in Singapore. The Singapore company invested in Flipkart in India. Flipkart was bought out of by Walmart. So what Walmart does was they came in Singapore level and bought out the shares of the Singaporean company. By virtue, they got the stake in Flipkart. Now, TG said that, and these assets were held acquired before 1st April 2017. So by virtue of which the gains have been grandfathered. The TG went to the officer asking for a nil withholding certificate. The officer said no. That I would not. This is not a transaction for the. I mean, this is a transaction which is for avoiding tax. So this is not. I would not give you the nil withholding certificate. Also, TG went to the officer to avoid. Because this would have been a litigation matter because the amount was involved was very high. So they wanted to directly go to the Supreme Court in 4-5 years rather than going through the assessment process of AO, CIT, ITAT, High Court, Supreme Court. So then they went to the Advanced Ruling Authority. Okay. Now the department reviewed the organization structure, the investment process, the board meeting minutes, the bank signatory, who is the bank signatory for the fund, the transaction documents. The AAR held, I mean, this is a very interesting thing, that the primary objective was to act as an investment holding company for the portfolio investment domiciled outside Mauritius. The control and management did not mean by day-to-day affairs of the business, but maintain the head of brain of the company. So you might have someone that who manages the daily affairs, but the head and the brain is situated outside Mauritius. The authority to operate bank accounts above USD $250,000 was only with two persons who are board of directors of the taxpayer and was only required to be countersigned. So here what was happening was the authority to sign beyond a particular threshold was with the directors of TG Global, which effectively was a US company. So the key personnel and of TG Global, which is a US company, were managing and controlling the affairs of the entire organization structure. The funds were ultimately controlled by these two people of US, and therefore they have concluded that the sale of these assets are based out of US, not from Mauritius. This has opened up Pandora's box, and Tiger Global has gone to High Court to appeal against this. Because I mean, everyone does this. I mean, there's no thing, and there has been an AAR ruling in favor of the SSC for sale of Indian shares held by a Mauritius company. But what AAR has said is that this is sale of Singaporean shares, not of shares of Indian companies held by Mauritius. So this does not apply, which is very weird. I mean, and this has been discussed across the private equity board, but I mean, that's what the judgment is. So effectively, the tax officers have been going. Even the GAR is not applicable till date, but the tax officers have been imposing GAR. This is sort of a GAR, sort of a transaction, and which I mean, I think it will go to the Supreme Court level, and the judgment will happen there. The next is GAR, I mean, General Anti-Avoidance Rule. So GAR invocation will apply, and GAR applies to domestic companies as well. So GAR will be invoked only if the transaction is not an arm's length, it is a misuse or abuse of a tax provision, lacks commercial substance, and not for a bona fide purpose. So what happens is people coming from Mauritius, now for funds coming through Mauritius, what the officers are saying and what the tax department is saying is that suppose you were a US investor, you could have directly come to India, invested in India. Why did you come via Mauritius? So there is an argument for it and against it that Mauritius is a commercially, you have to create a commercial guidelines. Plus, you need to create a more substance. I mean, in the Mauritius entity, so you have to have a director sitting there. So, I mean, this is a very recent, regulation. So, I mean, there's not been much discussion on this around this, but this would be a topic for the future. I mean, how tax authorities look at one organization and does not look at another organization. So you might have a case where they might say that a Singapore company opening a Mauritius fund and investing via the Mauritius fund was to manage the dividend. Not there can be multiple things. DAR is applicable only for transactions post 1st April 2017. However, I mean our tax authorities have been going behind as well. Quantum of tax benefits above a monetary limit of INR 3 crores. So the tax benefit has to be more than 3 crores. So 3 crores effectively means 10 crores transaction because 30% if I take a ballpark number. It does not involve certain foreign institutional investment, that's FPI transactions, which have been done on the exchange, and also does not include derivative transactions. AIF, this is this is about I think 4-5 years back. This regulation was brought by SEBI. So AIF is sort of a specialized investment vehicle. So AIF is a registered entity with SEBI, and there are 3 categories: category 1, 2, 3, and AIF has to be managed by an Indian investment manager. The sectorial restrictions do not apply to AIF. So you can have an investor investing in AIF and then the AIF investing in multiple companies. So suppose even in defense, if some fund wants to invest in defense in India, they can come via the AIF route. Other considerations for the structures and all the MLIs which have been recently. I mean, MLI is a completely different topic. Then safe harbor rules is, very limited applicability, transfer pricing regulations, and the gift city, which is now the new thing that is coming up. I mean, the regulations are not that clear, so I've not gone in detail with that. Now, coming to the structures. So this is a typical private equity structure. So you generally would have an offshore investor. So offshore investor would typically be a US investor, UK investor. They would invest. They would have a pooling vehicle somewhere. Then they would invest in a tax efficient jurisdiction, which is generally Mauritius or Singapore. The onshore fund would have an investment manager who would provide fund management services. So the onshore fund would invest either via SPV for specific investments, or it would invest directly in the investee course. You will have an Indian advisor which would provide non-binding investment advisory services to the investment manager. This is with the co-investment. So you have a co-investor. Now, what happens for global funds? Co-investment vehicle is used to manage carry. So what people do is that they would create a co-investment vehicle and would pass on carry along with the investment returns for the Indian or the foreign partners, so that it's not taxed as business as salary, or it is taxed as capital gains. This is a very gray area. Carry is one of the very gray areas in the private equity world, because the amount is very huge, and carry is generally between the employee and the fund. It's not with the sub-advisor. So tax authorities can take a call that this is nothing but your income, and then you have to pay tax at cost plus whatever markup. Now, this is a co-investor. That you have a pooling vehicle. Pooling vehicle generally are in Cayman, British, BVI, that kind of jurisdiction. Then they come to Mauritius. Again, the investment advisor is there, and there's an investment advisor, and they provide, they invest directly into India. Investment advisor generally has a cost plus mechanism. So you have a cost plus 20%, which is a typical industry rate. department for one or two cases had said cost plus 25. There was one Motilal case, I believe. But other than that, it's generally cost plus 20, which is charged by from the investment advisor to the investment manager. Then this is a unified structure. So when you say unified structure, this is a structure which is used for both domestic investors as well as foreign investors. So you will have the same co-investments, which goes to a tax efficient structure that is Mauritius, and there you have onshore investments. So onshore investments would be investing in onshore AI, and the onshore fund would be investing in the onshore fund, which is the Indian fund. This is India. This is the tax efficient jurisdiction. This is the overseas jurisdiction. Now the considerations that you need to take care for structuring is for offshore investments, there are indirect transfers. Then for onshore funds, there is the AOP guidelines, I mean the trust taxation. Then for onshore funds, you have GAR, OMP, capital gains and business income. For investment advisor, the transfer pricing norms like the cost is 20% or cost is 40%. Then you have safe harbor norms for the investment advisors regulations that are there. So there is a comparison between the Mauritius and Singapore. This is a slide based on my experience. I mean, don't hold me against this. But this is one. Mauritius is a cheaper jurisdiction than Singapore. So a typical Mauritian entity for managing a Mauritian entity in a year would typically cost a fund about $30,000 to $40,000 US dollars. But for a Singapore fund, you need to spend at least $200,000, $1,000, I mean, in a year, and that's a pretty significant amount. It includes management fees expense, but again, Singapore is expensive, and the compliances are more stringent than Mauritius. Then Singapore also requires a Singaporean director in every entity. Mauritius does not have that restriction. Singapore is considered by tax authorities as a better jurisdiction because the regulations are more stricter there. And so now there's also a new concept of a Singapore variable capital company, and there was a thing called Mauritius Protected Cell Company. So protected cell and a variable capital company is nothing but you have multiple classes of shares. So you have an investment share, which is the management share, and the company would have multiple sub shares. So you have class A, class B, class C, class D. Every class is protected from the other class. So the liability of say class B will not go to liability of class A. So class A shares can have 10 investors, class B can have 5 investors, class C can have 20 investors with having completely different investment objectives and having completely different investment ideas. So you have, and the liabilities of A, B, C would not be commingled. So you'll have separate liabilities. However, for the Indian taxation purposes, our authorities do not understand these concepts till now. So the liability of the entire fund is taken as the liability. So if you have an income tax liability of class A, it might flow to class B and C as well. Whereas other liabilities for the purpose of like Singapore jurisdiction and Mauritius, they would be completely different. Moving to the FDI process. So for a fund, the first is the deal comes from either an investment banker or a company directly, which goes to the deal sourcing team. So typically, a private equity office has very limited employees. So, I mean, our office in Bombay has about 8 employees. We started with 4, so and 8 is pretty high. But generally, it's 4 or 5 employees. You'll have a managing partner. You'll have 2 principals and 1 associate who work, and a compliance and finance person, as well as an admin help, which is required. So about 6 people would be a typical private equity company size. It's a smaller one. Then when they grow, we will get size. So the deal sourcing team performs the initial evaluation, whether it fits in the goal of the fund or not. Then they prepare a concept clearance for the investment committee. This concept clearance is generally a 2-pager document or 3-pager document, which says that this is the deal. I mean, are you okay with this basic document? Then a basic understanding of the deal. If the committee says okay, go ahead, then they will provide basic diligence and a business understanding. Here you meet the promoters, you do a business understanding, diligence, and also the industry diligences. Then you have a preliminary investment committee meeting. So you present a PIC memo to the preliminary investment committee meeting. The committee would say, okay, this deal is viable or not viable, and then you sign a non-binding term sheet with the company or with the seller. Then you perform a commercial, finance, legal due diligence of the company. Commercial business diligence is generally done by the private equity team. Uh, Unless you need specific market inputs wherein you cannot uh, where you're relying on certain data from things that you cannot check. Other than that, the business diligence is generally done by the private equity team. The finance and legal due diligence are generally done by the CA practice or the big fours and big sixes. Then you get after everything is okay, then you get a final investment committee clearance for the transaction. Then you enter within SPA, and then you make the investment. Uh, Now, this is very important for the private equity investment documentation for the FDI. The documented, so you need to have a documented preliminary investment committee approval, non-binding term sheets, due diligence reports. Everything has to be documented in a way because what happens is you might lose certain documents. I mean, generally so if you invest today, your exits happen at around after 6 years. So after 6 years, someone needs to access those documents, create a paper trail. These documents are pretty important in that. So for the regulatory filing, okay, you need to file. So you'll have to file the transaction documents with the authorized dealers. You need to file a valuation certificate as well. So a valuation certificate has to be certified by a merchant banker or a chartered accountant can also give a valuation certificate under the FEMA rules. So for the valuation certificate, you have to ensure that the valuation, if the money is coming in India, the value has to be higher than what value has been given by the certificate. So suppose the valuation certificate is of ₹100, the value has to be of 105, 10. It cannot be below ₹100. So if suppose I get it 90 rupees, then you have to take specific RBI approval that you are investing at a lower value. If it's higher, then there's no problem. Then you have to. There's a 6-pointer KYC. This is very important for the transaction to flow through properly. You need to tell your remitting bank that kindly issue a 6-point KYC. It contains your name, your address, your details, and your relationship with the bank. So this comes in the SWIFT message from that bank to the Indian bank. The Indian bank, when they convert the money and they remit it to the company, would issue an FIRC. FIRC and this document would be their part of that document set. These two document sets would be required to be filed with RBI for FCGPR and FCTRS purposes. Now, Form FCGPR. Now, Form FCGPR is applicable if a non-resident is investing in India. So if your money is flowing from foreign to India, it has to be filed by the non-resident. So it can be either filed by the buyer or the seller, but within 60 days of receipt of funds. So in that, you need to file all the transaction documents. You have a pre-post holding, and RBI approval if it is by non-automatic route, and other documents. Registration of the entity on the firms portal. So there's a RBI firms portal where you need to register. The application has to be submitted on that. The application can be submitted by an Indian chartered accountant on behalf of the fund as well. But for that, you need a power of attorney and all the required documents, a deed of indemnity, which you need to submit to the RBI along with your submissions that you are signing on behalf of the private equity fund. Now, this form FCGPR is very important. I mean, it is one of the most important documents that you should be submitting in case of a foreign direct investment transaction. because if you there is an RBI approval letter that comes after you submit the form FCGPR. If you don't have that letter, I mean, I'm saying this again because this has been a pain point for me as well, because transaction design before I joined the company. If you don't have the FCGPR letter, you cannot sell the securities under FDI regulations. So if you buy something and you don't get an RBI approval, then you would not be able to get any benefits. I mean, you cannot sell those securities. I know funds which have been struggling, and what happens is, if right now the RBI has allowed the buyer also to file the forms. Previously, in one or two cases, what had happened was the private equity fund had a fight with the promoter. Now, because of this, and the promoter did not file the form FCGPR, and because of this fight, the private equity fund could not sell the securities because their form FCGPR was not held. It was not approved by the RBI. So this becomes a very big pain point for everyone. I mean, so the form FCGPR is required to be filed. And for sale transaction, if you are remitting money outside India, you need to file a form 15 CSEB. For form 15 CSEB, I think ideally CS should collect the TRCs, the declaration under 10F and any other declaration. Again, for valuation certificate, you will have a purchase value and sale value of security which has to be. So the value of securities paid should be lower than the valuation. Suppose the valuation comes at 100, you have to pay 90 rupees. And FCTRS is applicable when the transfer happens between a non-resident to a resident. Again, 60 days norms applies. So if a non-resident is selling to the resident, that form FCGPR is applicable. Now, in other case, where the form, when the non-resident is selling to the non-resident, form FCGPR is not applicable. There is only a paper reporting to RBI that is required. That is also not as per law, but good housekeeping practice. You should file a paper reporting that we've sold these shares to RBI. Thank you, I mean, for listening to me, and I hope people have not fallen asleep. Thank you.
Hello, Shrikant.
Yeah.
Hello. There are some questions in a chat box, so I'm starting with that. First question is by CA Aditya Maheshwari. Considering the fund size, what are the professional opportunities for SME practitioner in this field?
Okay. So, see, there are multiple avenues that are available. One, for buying and selling securities, you need to have valuation certificate. The valuation certificate is there. When you are making a remittance outside India, you have your Form 15 CACB that needs to be filed. There you have a benefit. And typically, the private equity funds would not have a digital certificate. So, in that case, you can do the filings on their behalf after, of course, taking all the necessary documents. Then, in case of AIFs, you can be managing these days. There's a CFO. There's a my CFO sort of a thing that is applicable. So the Indian officers, what has happened is, I mean, to cut cost and cut corners, I mean, people would prefer the finance roles are not very significant for the Indian officers. You can provide outsourcing services to the fund managers, so that you can handle their financing compliances better. For tax filing, again, they don't have a digital signature generally, so you can provide the digital signature and tax filing first. For diligences, generally the private equity funds prefer Big Fours, and that's the norm. But what you can offer to the investee companies in this case is, if your company is getting a filing, that you prepare the data in such a way that the diligence happens smoothly. Because what happens is, and in diligence is, this has been a feedback that companies are not geared up for a Big Four sort of a diligence. You gear up the company on behalf, and then the diligence just happens smoothly. So these are the avenues which I can think of for
Thanks, Shrikant.
Okay. Second question is from CA Punit Gupta ji. Are there any maximum limits for the investment in AIF in India? using an polling structure, can this be met, or individual investors should contribute the minimum amount?
What happens is the investor has to minimum. I mean, for AIF investment, you need a minimum of 1 crore rupees of investment. So if an investor is investing, the minimum is 1 crore. I mean, I'm not an AIF expert, but I mean, offhand, if I remember correctly, it's 1 crore rupees investment is required. Other than that, there is a minimum sponsor commitment of 5% of the total investment size of or 5 crore rupees. So whoever is starting an AIF and he's managing the AIF funds would have to necessarily invest 5% or 5 crores, whichever is lower. I mean, whichever is higher in the fund himself. And using a pooling structure, I mean, there's no maximum restriction in AIFs. I mean, you have big AIFs as well. However, minimum there's a typical ticket size of I think 10 crores or something, which is I mean I don't remember offhand, but I think it's 10 crores, which is there that a minimum AIF size has to be that much. So that's my answer.
Okay, one more question from my side. What is the maximum limit to cap the fund? Means what is the time limit? Any has been specified, or it can be kept? Any time limit has been specified to invest in the. Suppose
Sorry.
Once the funds received in India with the any channel partner, what is the time limit that it has been specified? Anything? Anytime they can withdraw.
If I understand your question correctly, what you are saying is if a foreign investor has put in money in India in the AIF.
Right.
There's no time limit as such, but that's again agreement between the AIF sponsor and the AIF itself. And generally, what happens is when you receive money, I mean, your IRR meter starts.
Okay.
So the funds generally, I mean, for us also, what we do is we borrow funds from US banks before issuing a capital call. So what happens is I use that money and I save that IRR cost, because that IRR cost is more than the interest cost that I'll be bearing.
Okay.
So the IRR management is important for the funds. So if you have money sitting in your books, then it would be different. So that's one. Secondly, for the AIF, I think it has to be a close-ended scheme, but you can have a capital commitment. So suppose I say I will commit 100 crore rupees to invest in an AIF. So 100 crores is my capital commitment. So whenever I get an investment opportunity, I would make the capital call and then issue the capital call and then receive the money and then make the investment.
Okay. Thank you.
I thought the question is like after drawdown, there's a time limit to invest something, or we can just keep.
There's no time limit as such, but you would not prefer to keep the money for a long time because the IRR meter starts.
Correct.
Okay.
And also, I mean, if you have investments, if you're not making investments, then again, you need to for Indian companies, yes, there is a limit that you need to issue securities. I think with as per RBI, within 120 days of receipt of funds. If you don't issue the shares, then you might have to refund the amount back. But that's not applicable for AIFs, I think.
Okay. One more question is from CA Rajesh Poddar. How is private equity different from the retail one?
No, so REIT is completely different. REIT is an Indian, it's sort of an Indian AIF or an Indian fund. So it is set up in India. Private equity is set up abroad. That's one. REIT only invests in real estate sectors, and REIT you can have an IPO of REIT as well, and you can get a REIT listed. However, the private equity fund, you cannot get. I can get my fund listed on the Indian exchange. It's a foreign company to meet those guidelines. So that's a broad difference. And of course, a private equity fund can invest in REITs, but other way around is not possible. I hope I've answered it.
There was one reverse question by Puneet Gupta sir. One more question was there.
Yeah, it's not a reverse question. It is. So I mean, this question is there everywhere. MT199 is, but what you do is in this case is check with the local bankers what alternative documents can work in this. So even if the privacy laws do not allow that, uh, you can take a good certificate of good standing or something like that from the bank. Which I mean, see, I have looked at Mauritius, Singapore, Cayman. These jurisdictions generally don't have a problem. However, other European jurisdictions may have this problem. So what you can do is effectively take some certificate of good standing or take a bank statement and submit it to the Indian bankers if that's allowed. I mean, I've never come across a case where the banks don't issue 199, but in that case, the Indian bankers are also relatively okay. If, if there's a specific, take that on email and go to the Indian bankers. I mean, if you want funds to be handled, there's a way. There might be a way out by then.
Okay, any more questions?
I think Puneet has again asked me the question: how many years of a relationship? So that instead of mentioning that, just ask them to mention that they have been holding our account since say a particular date. So instead of mentioning how many years of relationship, even if that is not allowed by them, just mention that they have been holding our account and then there is a certificate of good standing that the banks generally issue, which you can get from the banks. I think that might be a solution to the problem.
So now, thanks Shrikant Maheshwari for giving this wonderful lecture. I request CA Deepak Mandeja, Deputy Conveyor, to give the hearty vote of thanks.
Thank you, Amish. Thank you very much. First of all, today is a very proud moment for Andheri Oshiwara Study Circle that our own member Shrikant Maheshwari, means son of Radheshamji Falod and brother of Aditya Maheshwari, that he has delivered a fantastic speech and he has shared his experience. So I'm sure today Radheshamji Falod, you must be a proud father today. First. And second thing, as far as the session was concerned, as far as the topic is concerned, it is a very new topic for everyone because majority of the people are practicing in traditional areas. So it is a very new topic, but you covered each and every aspect of the today's topic in a very simple, lucid, in a plain language. And you firstly told that that we have a myth that it contains a lot of jargon, but after listening you, it does not contains any jargon. It is a plain thing, each and every, but only thing क्या है कि लोगों ने बना के रखा है कि बहुत complicated है, complex है. So as far as all the issues now, means starting from foreign direct investment, then foreign portfolio investment, then taxation structures, then how the FDI do the investment, and what is the exit process. Each and everything was explained very through practical experience and practical case laws. So I'm very thankful, Shrikant, that you invested your time and you delivered this webinar, and it was a great learning experience for each and every member of AOSC today. Thank you very much. And I want to say that it was a great initiative taken by Shrikant, and in future also we would like a lot of members from our study circle becoming speakers and delivering the lectures on various other topics. So thank you very much once again, Shrikant, and Amish, over to you.
I thanks everyone for the attending today's webinar. And next Saturday, we are planning for having a webinar on this Udyam MSME registration. Just we are finalizing with the speaker. Maybe it may be a Friday or a Saturday, depending upon the speaker availability. And next Sunday also we had one, coming Sunday we had a lecture tapping opportunities at the abroad. Thank you everyone for giving their time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. We are closing the session. Thanks.